Flight 862 was climbing through 8,000 feet when the left engine exploded in a ball of flame and smoke, sending the aircraft into a violent roll that threw passengers against their seats. In the chaos that followed, as the pilots struggled with emergency procedures and failing systems, nobody expected salvation to come from the woman in the orange safety vest who had been loading luggage just 20 minutes earlier. But when both pilots were overcome by smoke inhalation, Jessica Martinez stepped into the cockpit with the calm confidence of someone who had faced far worse emergencies in very different skies. Jessica had been working the morning shift at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, her bright orange safety vest marking her as part of the ground crew that kept one of America's busiest airports running smoothly. To the passengers boarding Flight 862, she was just another face in the sea of airport workers, someone who loaded their bags, guided aircraft to gates, and ensured their flights departed on time. What they didn't know was that before Jessica Martinez had spent 3 years loading suitcases and marshaling aircraft, she had been Captain Jessica Martinez, one of the Air Force's most experienced test pilots. For 15 years, she had pushed experimental aircraft to their limits, testing new technologies and emergency procedures that would later save countless lives in both military and civilian aviation. But that was before the accident. 3 years ago, during a routine test flight of a new fighter prototype, a catastrophic system failure had sent her aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Jessica had ejected safely, but her co-pilot and best friend, Captain Sarah Chen, hadn't been so lucky. The investigation had cleared Jessica of any wrongdoing. The failure was mechanical, unpredictable, and unavoidable. But surviving when Sarah didn't had broken something inside Jessica that no amount of counseling or commendations could fix. She'd taken early retirement from the Air Force, moved to Dallas, and deliberately chosen the most ordinary job she could find. Loading baggage was simple, predictable, safe. There were no split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. No experimental aircraft with untested systems. No responsibility for anyone's life but her own. For 3 years, it had worked. Jessica had found peace in the routine, in the physical work, in being anonymous. She woke up, went to work, loaded planes, and went home. Simple. Until Flight 862 changed everything. Jessica had been working the cargo hold of the Boeing 737 when she heard the explosion. The sound was unmistakable, a catastrophic engine failure that sent shockwaves through the aircraft and across the tarmac.
She looked up to see the plane, which had taken off just minutes earlier, trailing black smoke as it banked sharply to the left. Every instinct she developed during 15 years as a test pilot screamed at her to move, to help, to do something. But for 3 years, she trained herself to ignore those instincts. She wasn't a pilot anymore. She was ground crew. Then she heard the radio chatter. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Southwest 862. We have catastrophic engine failure, heavy smoke in the cockpit, requesting immediate return to DFW." The voice was strained, professional, but Jessica could hear the underlying panic. She knew that sound. It was the voice of a pilot dealing with more problems than training had prepared them for. "Southwest 862, cleared for immediate return, runway 18 right. Emergency services are responding." Jessica watched as fire trucks and ambulances raced toward the runway, the standard emergency response. But she also watched the aircraft's erratic flight pattern as it struggled to maintain altitude and heading. Something was very wrong. Her radio crackled with ground crew communications. "All personnel, clear runway 18 right for emergency landing. Southwest 862 inbound with engine failure." Jessica should have moved away from the runway area like every other ground crew member. Instead, she found herself moving closer, watching the aircraft's approach with the trained eye of someone who had spent years evaluating emergency landings. The approach was too steep. The aircraft was descending too fast. The pilots were either unconscious or incapacitated. Jessica ran. She reached the emergency services staging area just as Flight 862 touched down hard on runway 18 right. The landing was rough, but survivable, barely. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled onto the runway with smoke pouring from both the damaged engine and, more ominously, from the cockpit windows. "Ground crew, stay back!" shouted Fire Chief Rodriguez, as his teams deployed foam and began their approach to the aircraft. But Jessica was already moving. She grabbed an emergency air pack from one of the fire trucks and ran toward the aircraft's emergency exit stairs that were being deployed by the airport's rapid response team. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," called one of the firefighters. Jessica turned, and something in her expression made him pause. "I'm going into that cockpit. Those pilots need help now." "You can't do that. You're ground crew." "No," Jessica said, already heading up the emergency stairs. "I'm a pilot." Inside the aircraft, chaos reigned.
Passengers were evacuating through the emergency slides while flight attendants tried to maintain order. Smoke filled the cabin, making breathing difficult and visibility poor. But Jessica moved through it with purpose, her borrowed air pack giving her clean oxygen as she made her way toward the cockpit. The cockpit door was open, and what she saw inside confirmed her worst fears. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, overcome by smoke inhalation. Captain Williams was unconscious, while First Officer Davis was semi-conscious but clearly disoriented and unable to function. Jessica didn't hesitate. She quickly checked both pilots' vital signs, alive but incapacitated, then turned her attention to the aircraft systems. The engines were shut down, the aircraft was stopped, but there were still multiple warning lights and alarms indicating ongoing problems. "This is ground crew member Martinez in the cockpit. Both pilots are down. Aircraft systems show multiple failures. I'm going to need medical personnel in here immediately." "Copy that. Medical team is en route. Are you qualified to assess the aircraft systems?" Jessica looked at the instrument panel, the same basic layout she'd studied for 15 years, though updated with newer navionics. Her hands found the controls instinctively as she began shutting down non-essential systems and ensuring the aircraft was safe. "Affirmative," she said simply. What she didn't say was that she was more than qualified. She was one of the most experienced emergency procedures pilots the Air Force had ever trained. Paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly taking over care of the pilots, while Jessica continued to secure the aircraft. As Captain Williams was placed on a stretcher, he regained consciousness briefly. Who's handling the aircraft?" he asked weakly. "I am," Jessica said, leaning over him. "I'm a pilot. You did good work getting this bird on the ground." Williams managed to nod before losing consciousness again. As the medical team worked, Jessica completed the post-emergency shutdown procedures, documenting the various system failures and ensuring the aircraft was completely safe. Fire Chief Rodriguez appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Miss Martinez, I need to ask, how did you know to do all this?" Jessica looked up from the logbook where she'd been recording the emergency procedures. 15 years, Air Force test pilot, retired 3 years ago. Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up. "Test pilot? Ma'am, what are you doing working ground crew?" Jessica finished writing and closed the logbook. "Taking a break from flying." But even as she said it, Jessica realized something had changed.
For the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. The emergency procedures, the split-second decisions, the responsibility for other people's safety, it all felt natural, right, like putting on a familiar uniform. The investigation into Flight 862's emergency took 3 days. Jessica found herself interviewed by the National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Aviation Administration, and Southwest Airlines Safety Department. Her actions during the emergency were praised as textbook perfect, exactly what any experienced pilot should have done. But the questions kept coming. Why was a test pilot working ground crew? When was she planning to return to aviation? Did she realize that her quick thinking had probably saved both pilots' lives? Jessica answered honestly, but she also found herself thinking about questions she'd avoided for 3 years. Questions about purpose, about using her skills, about whether running away from who she was had really helped anyone. The breakthrough came during her interview with Dr. Amanda Foster, a flight psychologist with the FAA, who specialized in helping pilots return to duty after traumatic incidents. Jessica, I've reviewed your military file and the circumstances of your retirement. You suffered a traumatic loss during a test flight. Captain Chen was my best friend, Jessica said quietly. She died because we were testing an experimental aircraft that wasn't ready. But the investigation cleared you of any fault. The mechanical failure was unpredictable. I was the senior pilot. I was responsible for that aircraft and everyone in it. Dr. Foster leaned forward. And last week, you were responsible for an aircraft and everyone in it again. How did that feel? Jessica was quiet for a long moment. Different, she said finally. How so? When Sarah died, I felt like I'd failed her, like I wasn't good enough to be trusted with other people's lives. But last week, when I saw those pilots needed help, Jessica paused. I didn't think about whether I was good enough. I just did what needed to be done. And the result? Both pilots survived. The aircraft was secured. Everyone went home to their families. Dr. Foster smiled. Jessica, survivor's guilt is real and powerful. But sometimes the best way to honor those we've lost is to keep using our gifts to help others. That evening, Jessica sat in her small apartment, staring at a letter that had arrived that afternoon. It was from Southwest Airlines, offering her a position as a commercial pilot with fast-track certification and immediate placement in their training program. But there was also another letter, this one from the Air Force, signed by General Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer. Captain Martinez, your actions during the Flight 862 emergency remind us why we were sorry to lose you 3 years ago. The test pilot school has an opening for a senior instructor position. Your experience with emergency procedures could save countless lives by training the next generation of military pilots. Jessica set both letters on her kitchen table and walked to her window. Outside, she could see the lights of DFW Airport, aircraft taking off and landing in the carefully choreographed dance of modern aviation. Somewhere out there, pilots were making the same kind of split-second decisions she'd once made, carrying the same responsibility she'd once carried. For 3 years, she'd told herself she was done with that responsibility, that she'd earned the right to a simple, quiet life. But the truth was, she missed it. She missed the challenge, the precision, the knowledge that her skills could make the difference between life and death. Her phone rang. It was Captain Williams calling from his hospital bed. Jessica, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. The doctors say I'm going to make a full recovery. I'm glad to hear that, Captain. How's First Officer Davis? He's doing well too. But I also wanted to ask you something. The airline wants to do a formal recognition ceremony. They're calling you a hero. Jessica winced. I'm not a hero, Captain. I just did what any pilot would do. That's exactly my point, Williams said. You did what any pilot would do, but you weren't acting as a pilot. You were ground crew who stepped up when needed. That's what makes you special. After hanging up, Jessica picked up both letters again. 2 different paths back to the sky. 2 different ways to use the skills she'd spent 15 years developing. She thought about Sarah, about the conversation they'd had the night before that last flight. Jess, Sarah had said, you know why I love being a test pilot?
Because you're crazy enough to fly experimental aircraft? Sarah had laughed. No, because every time we push these planes to their limits, every emergency procedure we test, every system we validate, it all goes into making flying safer for everyone else. We're not just flying planes, we're saving lives we'll never meet. Jessica looked at the letters again, then picked up her phone and dialed. General Hayes, this is Captain Martinez. I received your letter. Jessica, I was hoping you'd call. Are you interested in the instructor position? I am, but I have a condition. What's that? I want to develop a new emergency procedures curriculum.
One that focuses not just on handling mechanical failures, but on making the kinds of rapid decisions that can save lives when everything goes wrong. There was a pause. That sounds exactly like what we need. When can you start? Give me 2 weeks to finish up my commitments here. Jessica, can I ask what changed your mind? Jessica looked out her window at the airport lights again. I realized that honoring Sarah's memory doesn't mean running away from flying. It means using what she and I learned together to make sure other pilots are prepared for the worst-case scenarios. She would be proud of you. I hope so, General. I hope so. 2 weeks later, Captain Jessica Martinez walked into the Air Force Test Pilot School wearing her uniform for the first time in 3 years. The building looked the same, smelled the same, felt the same, but Jessica was different. She was no longer running from her responsibility to other pilots. She was embracing it. Her first class was a group of 12 young pilots, all eager to learn the advanced emergency procedures that could one day save their lives and the lives of their crews. As Jessica looked at their faces, she saw echoes of her younger self, confident, skilled, but not yet tested by real crises. Good morning, she began. I'm Captain Martinez, and I'm going to teach you how to handle emergencies that your training manual says are impossible to survive. One of the students raised his hand. Captain, how do we prepare for impossible situations? Jessica smiled, thinking of Sarah, of Flight 862, of the 3 years she'd spent trying to forget who she was. By remembering that impossible situations are just ones you haven't trained for yet, and by understanding that every emergency you survive makes you better equipped to help someone else survive the next one. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote, Emergency Procedures, Thinking Beyond the Checklist. Today, we're going to start with a scenario. You're flying a test aircraft when you experience catastrophic engine failure. Your co-pilot is unconscious. You have limited altitude and multiple systems failures. Your training manual says this situation is unrecoverable. She turned back to the class. Anyone want to tell me what you do next? A young lieutenant raised her hand. Follow emergency procedures? Attempt to restart the engine? Look for a suitable landing site? Good start, Jessica said. But what if the emergency procedures don't work? What if the engine can't be restarted? What if there's no suitable landing site? The students looked uncertain. Then, Jessica continued, you stop following the book and start writing a new chapter.
Because sometimes saving lives means doing things that have never been done before. Over the next 6 months, Captain Jessica Martinez developed the most comprehensive emergency procedures curriculum the Air Force had ever seen. Her students didn't just learn to follow checklists, they learned to think creatively under pressure, to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, and to never give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. But more than that, they learned from someone who had faced real emergencies, who had lost someone she cared about, and who had found her way back to the sky, not in spite of that loss, but because of it. The program's success was measured not just in test scores or simulation results, but in the real-world emergencies where Jessica's students used their training to save lives.
when Captain Rodriguez successfully landed a fighter jet with total hydraulic failure. He credited Jessica's unconventional thinking exercises. When Lieutenant Davis talked her way through a complete electrical failure using creative problem-solving techniques, she sent Jessica a thank you note. And when the test pilot school received a request to train civilian emergency response pilots, General Hayes knew exactly who to ask to head the program. "Jessica," she said, calling her into the office one afternoon, "we've been asked to develop emergency procedures training for commercial airlines. Interested in expanding your curriculum?" Jessica looked at the proposal documents. It would mean training not just military pilots, but civilian crews who might one day face the same kind of emergency she'd helped resolve on Flight 862. "General, I'd like to tell you about someone who should be part of this program. Captain Williams and First Officer Davis from Southwest Airlines. They handled an impossible emergency with skill and professionalism. I think they could help us understand what civilian crews really need." "The pilots from Flight 862? The ones you helped save?" "The ones who saved themselves," Jessica corrected. "I just provided backup when they needed it." General Hayes smiled. "You know, Jessica, 3 years ago when you left the Air Force, I thought we were losing one of our best pilots. But what we really lost was one of our best teachers. I'm glad you found your way back to both." That evening, Jessica stood on the flight line at Edwards Air Force Base, watching test pilots prepare for night flights. The scene was familiar. She'd stood in this same spot hundreds of times during her 15 years as an active pilot. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't thinking about the flights she'd never take again, or the friend she'd lost, or the 3 years she'd spent hiding from her calling.
Tonight, she was thinking about the young pilots she was training, about the emergency procedures that might one day save their lives, and about the knowledge that her experience, both the triumphs and the tragedies, was being used to make aviation safer for everyone. Her phone buzzed with a text message from one of her students. "Captain Martinez, just wanted you to know I used your impossible scenarios training in a real emergency today. Everyone made it home safely. Thank you for teaching us to think beyond the manual." Jessica smiled and typed back, "That's what we do it for. Proud of you." A year after returning to the Air Force, Jessica received an unexpected invitation. Southwest Airlines was hosting a ceremony to commemorate the first anniversary of Flight 826's emergency landing, and they wanted her to be the guest of honor. She almost declined. Public recognition had never been something she sought, and the last year had been focused on building her training program, not reliving past events. But when she learned that Captain Williams and First Officer Davis would be there, along with several passengers from the flight, she decided to attend. The ceremony was held at DFW Airport, in the same terminal where Flight 826 had been scheduled to depart a year earlier. Jessica arrived in her Air Force dress uniform, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding the importance of the event. Captain Williams approached her first, walking without assistance, despite the serious injuries he'd sustained during the emergency. "Captain Martinez, I can't believe it's been a year already." "Captain Williams, you're looking well. How's your recovery going?" "Complete recovery, thanks to the quick medical attention we received, but more importantly, thanks to you keeping us alive long enough to get that medical attention." Jessica shook her head. "You two did the hard work. I just helped with the aftermath." The aftermath that included ensuring we didn't have secondary fires, toxic gas exposure, or electrical failures that could have killed us while we were unconscious, First Officer Davis interjected, joining the conversation. "Captain Martinez, I've spent the last year learning about emergency procedures, and what you did goes far beyond basic first aid." The ceremony began with a presentation about aviation safety and the importance of emergency preparedness. Jessica listened as various officials praised the professionalism of the flight crew, the efficiency of the airport emergency response, and the extraordinary intervention of a qualified individual.
When it was her turn to speak, Jessica approached the podium with the same calm confidence she brought to her teaching. Thank you for this recognition, but I want to be clear about something. What happened on Flight 826 wasn't a miracle or an extraordinary intervention. It was the result of training, preparation, and teamwork. She looked out at the audience, which included not just aviation professionals, but also passengers from the flight and their families. Captain Williams and First Officer Davis had the training to handle the initial emergency and get their aircraft safely on the ground despite catastrophic system failures. The emergency response teams had the training to reach the aircraft quickly and provide immediate medical care. I had training that allowed me to secure the aircraft and assess the pilot's condition. Jessica paused, thinking about how to express what she'd learned over the past year. But here's what I want you to understand. That training only works when people are willing to use it, even when they're scared, even when the situation seems impossible, and even when they'd rather be somewhere else doing something safer. She looked directly at a group of young aviation students in the audience. For 3 years after leaving the Air Force, I chose the safest job I could find because I was afraid of being responsible for other people's lives again. But Flight 826 taught me that responsibility isn't something you can run away from. It's something you carry with you, and the only choice is whether you use it to help people or waste it trying to protect yourself. The applause was respectful, but Jessica noticed several people wiping their eyes. After the ceremony, she was approached by Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with 2 teenage children. Captain Martinez, I was on Flight 826, Seat 12C. I wanted to thank you, but more than that, I wanted to introduce you to my daughter Elena. Elena, about 16, with bright eyes and a confident smile, stepped forward. Captain Martinez, my mom told me all about what you did. I've decided I want to be a pilot too. Jessica felt her chest tighten with emotion. Elena, that's wonderful. Are you planning to pursue military or civilian aviation? I want to be a test pilot, like you were. My mom says you teach other pilots how to handle emergencies that seem impossible. That's right. We call it expanding the envelope, learning to handle situations that push aircraft and pilots beyond their normal limits. Elena's eyes lit up. Could you tell me about your training program? I'm starting college next year, and I want to make sure I'm preparing for the right path.
Jessica spent the next 20 minutes talking with Elena about aviation careers, educational requirements, and the realities of being a test pilot. As they talked, she realized something profound was happening. She was no longer just teaching pilots how to survive emergencies. She was inspiring the next generation to pursue aviation in the first place. After the ceremony, Jessica drove back to Edwards Air Force Base with a new understanding of her role. The training program she'd built wasn't just about emergency procedures. It was about creating a culture where pilots understood that their skills carried responsibility, and that responsibility was a privilege, not a burden. The next morning, she met with General Hayes to discuss expanding the program even further. Jessica, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding civilian training partnerships. What if we opened our program to civilian students, not just active pilots? Jessica looked up from the curriculum she'd been reviewing. You mean undergraduate students who are studying to become pilots? Exactly. We could partner with universities and flight schools to give future pilots exposure to advanced emergency procedures training from the beginning of their careers, rather than waiting until they're already flying commercially or militarily. Jessica considered the proposal. General, that's ambitious. It would mean completely restructuring how we think about pilot education. It would also mean that every pilot entering the field would have been exposed to the kind of creative problem-solving and emergency thinking that you've developed. Imagine if every pilot had those skills from day one. The idea excited Jessica more than she'd expected. We'd need to develop age-appropriate scenarios, create simulators that could handle the training load, recruit additional instructors. All doable if you're willing to head the program. Jessica thought about Elena Santos, about the bright-eyed young woman who wanted to be a test pilot, about all the future pilots who might benefit from learning that aviation was about more than just following procedures. General, I'm in, but I want to add one more component to the program. What's that? Mentorship. Every student gets paired with an experienced pilot who can guide them not just through the technical aspects, but through the psychological and emotional challenges of carrying responsibility for other people's lives. General Hayes smiled. You're thinking about more than just emergency training. You're thinking about creating better human beings who happen to be pilots. That's exactly what I'm thinking.
6 months later, the Advanced Aviation Emergency Response Training Program held its first civilian session. 30 undergraduate students from 5 different universities spent 2 weeks at Edwards Air Force Base learning not just how to fly aircraft, but how to think like pilots under pressure. Jessica watched from the observation deck as her instructors led the students through increasingly complex scenarios. In one simulation, a student named David Chen, no relation to Jessica's lost friend Sarah, but the name still gave her pause, was dealing with a scenario involving engine failure, unconscious crew members, and severe weather. David's handling this well, observed Captain Rodriguez, one of Jessica's assistant instructors. He's not just following the checklist, he's thinking 3 steps ahead. Jessica nodded, but she was thinking about something else. Rodriguez, do you remember what it was like when you first started flying, before you'd experienced a real emergency? You mean back when I thought the training manuals covered everything that could go wrong? Exactly. These students are learning from day one that the manual is just the starting point, that real flying means being prepared for situations that don't have predetermined solutions. It's going to change how they approach everything, Rodriguez agreed. Not just emergencies, but routine flights too. They'll always be thinking ahead, always be prepared. Jessica smiled. That's the goal. Pilots who understand that aviation is about more than just getting from point A to point B safely. It's about being ready to help when others can't help themselves. After the simulation, Jessica met individually with each student to debrief their performance. When David Chen sat down across from her, she could see both confidence and humility in his expression. David, you handled that scenario very well. How did it feel? Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I kept thinking about what you said on the first day, that emergency situations reveal who you really are as a pilot. And what did you learn about who you are? David was quiet for a moment. I learned that I don't panic under pressure, but I also learned that I need to trust my training more. There were moments when I second-guessed myself instead of acting on what I knew was right. Jessica nodded. That's a common response, and recognizing it is the first step to overcoming it. The goal isn't to eliminate doubt, it's to act effectively despite doubt. Captain Martinez, can I ask you something personal? Sure. My instructor mentioned that you took time away from flying before coming back to teach. What made you return?
Jessica looked at the young man across from her, seeing echoes of her own younger self, eager, talented, but not yet tested by real crisis. She thought about how to answer honestly without discouraging him. David, I learned that running away from responsibility doesn't make you safer, it just makes you less useful. When people need help, having the skills to provide that help is a privilege, not a burden.
even when helping others puts you at risk. Especially then, because that's when your training and your character matter most. David nodded thoughtfully. I think I understand. It's not about being fearless. It's about being useful despite being afraid. Jessica smiled. That might be the best definition of courage I've ever heard. The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Students who completed the training went on to distinguish themselves in both military and civilian aviation careers. More importantly, they carried with them an understanding that flying was about service, not just skill. 2 years after returning to the Air Force, Jessica received a letter that would change her perspective once again. It was from the International Civil Aviation Organization, asking her to help develop global standards for pilot emergency response training. Captain Martinez, the letter read, your innovative approach to emergency procedures training has been recognized as a potential model for international adoption. We would like to invite you to lead a task force to develop training standards that could be implemented worldwide. Jessica showed the letter to General Hayes during their weekly meeting. This is a remarkable opportunity, Jessica. Your program could influence pilot training globally. It's also a big responsibility, General. If we're setting international standards, we're potentially affecting every pilot who flies commercially anywhere in the world. And that doesn't excite you? Jessica looked out the window at the flight line, where test pilots were preparing for afternoon missions. It terrifies me, she said honestly, but it also feels like exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Because 3 years ago, I thought my responsibility was too heavy to carry. Now I realized it was too important not to carry. General Hayes leaned back in her chair. Jessica, you've come a long way from the person who wanted to load baggage for the rest of her life. I've learned that you can't run away from who you are. You can only decide whether to use your gifts or waste them. That evening, Jessica called Captain Williams to tell him about the international opportunity.
Captain Martinez, that's incredible news. Your training methods saved our lives, and now they could save lives worldwide. Captain, can I ask you something? When you woke up in that hospital after the emergency, what was the first thing you thought about? Honestly, I thought about how close we came to not making it. And I thought about the fact that if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't known what to do, he paused, we would have died. And our passengers would have lost husbands, wives, fathers, mothers. And how did that make you feel? Grateful, but also responsible. Like I needed to make sure other pilots were better prepared for that kind of emergency. Jessica smiled. Captain, would you be interested in helping me develop international training standards? You want a commercial pilot's perspective on the training? I want a survivor's perspective. Someone who knows what it's like when everything goes wrong and you have to depend on your training and the people around you. Captain Martinez, I would be honored to be part of that. 6 months later, Jessica stood before the International Civil Aviation Organization's assembly in Montreal, presenting training standards that had been developed through collaboration between military test pilots, commercial airline crews, emergency responders, and aviation psychologists. Members of the assembly, she began, we are proposing a fundamental shift in how we think about pilot training. Instead of preparing pilots only for scenarios that have happened before, we propose preparing them for scenarios that haven't happened yet. She clicked to her first slide, which showed statistics about aviation emergencies. Every year, pilots around the world face situations that weren't covered in their training manuals. Equipment failures, weather conditions, medical emergencies, and system malfunctions that require creative thinking and rapid decision-making under pressure. She paused, looking out at representatives from dozens of countries. The training standards we're proposing
would ensure that every pilot, regardless of where they're trained or which airline they fly for, has been exposed to advanced emergency procedures and creative problem-solving techniques. She clicked to her next slide, showing testimonials from pilots who had completed her program. But more than that, we're proposing training that helps pilots understand that their skills carry responsibility to their passengers, to their crews, and to the aviation community as a whole. The presentation concluded with a video message from Alana Santos, now a freshman at an aviation university and one of the first students to complete Jessica's expanded training program.
Captain Martinez taught me that being a pilot isn't just about flying planes. It's about being ready to help when no one else can. It's about understanding that your training is a gift that you hold in trust for everyone who will ever depend on you. The Assembly voted unanimously to adopt the new training standards. That evening, Jessica walked along the St. Lawrence River, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from loading baggage at DFW Airport to setting international aviation standards in Montreal. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Foster, the flight psychologist who had helped her process her return to aviation. "Jessica, I saw the news about the international training standards. Congratulations." "Thank you, Dr. Foster. I wanted to call you anyway. I've been thinking about our conversation from 2 years ago, when you asked me how it felt to be responsible for an aircraft again. I remember. You said it felt different from when you lost Captain Chen. It did feel different, but now I understand why. Tell me." Jessica watched a cargo ship moving slowly down the river, its lights reflecting on the water. "When Sarah died, I felt responsible for failing her. But when I helped save Captain Williams and First Officer Davis, I felt responsible for succeeding. The responsibility was the same. It was my relationship to it that changed." "How so?" "I stopped seeing responsibility as a burden that could crush me and started seeing it as a tool that could help others. Same weight, but different purpose." Dr. Foster was quiet for a moment. "Jessica, that might be the most profound description of post-traumatic growth I've ever heard. I think Sarah would approve of what I'm doing now. I think she would be proud." After hanging up, Jessica continued her walk along the river. Tomorrow, she would fly back to Edwards Air Force Base and continue developing training programs that would prepare pilots for the impossible. Next month, she would travel to airlines around the world, implementing the new international standards. But tonight, she was simply Jessica Martinez, a woman who had learned that hiding from responsibility was just another way of being irresponsible, and that the greatest tribute to those we've lost is to use what they taught us to help those we haven't met yet. She looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace with who she was and what she was meant to do. Captain Jessica Martinez had found her way back to the sky, and now she was helping others find their way there too.